was a little girl, I had strawberry blonde hair, and I was covered in freckles. And the only way I got a tan was if I went in the sun and all my freckles got together for a party. And my father worked in the forestry industry, and we lived in a small village of 800 people on the east coast of Canada. So I spent a lot of time in nature. We would do things like picking wild mushrooms and fiddleheads and fry them up for supper. We would clam dig with toilet plungers at the beach every other weekend. We would fish for rainbow trout in the streams. And in the winter, we would go cross-country skiing and eat our lunch from my dad's big World War II thermos. And we would have wieners and beans. And it was decadent because we were just in nature. And in this place, I also found a lot of space. I would relax on a piece of moss and just sink into the depth of its loveliness. Or in the winter, I would collapse on the snow into that silence and just look up into the trees and watch the branches of the trees swaying. And in that space, I would consider what brought me happiness in life and what brought me pleasure. In those tender years, I wasn't influenced by social media or other conditioning that influences what we're supposed to feel good about. And I had pure joy, and I knew what brought me happiness in that space. When I wasn't outside, I would often spend time inside, rifling through my parents' National Geographic magazines because they had this endless collection because they never threw anything out. And often I would settle on pictures of the animals in South Africa that just felt like they were from another planet to me. They were so huge and inspiring. And I dreamt that I would someday get there. I didn't know how or when, but it was a dream that I held close to my heart. And a couple of years ago, I finally had the opportunity to go to South Africa on what was called a rewilding safari. And I got to go into the wild wearing a big backpack and a thin little half-inch foam mattress with 7 other women and 2 animal trackers. And we got to sleep on rocks every night. It was like super uncomfortable. And there was something that we did which was a little unique. We decided to not speak for a few days. And in that time, we noticed a lot of things about the animals. I could have a snack of grapes, and a wild black rhinoceros would be off in the distance, happily eating, undisturbed by us. And then there was the day that we walked very close to some giraffes, just kind of weaving along as if we were imitating a snake. And the giraffes just didn't really know what to make of us, so they just kept eating, and I felt like I could walk right through between their 2 big long legs. We got so close to them. And also in that space, just like a pilot light flickers in the embers, my pleasure, my remembering of my pleasure and what brought me happiness in life was reignited. It's what I now call my pleasure fingerprint. I knew what brought me happiness in life without anybody else telling me. I, and only I, knew what brought me pleasure. And in that space, I took the time to consider my marriage. When we had made the choice to get married, I had based my decision on values that society had taught me were important in a partner. Things like being in love, having common interests. We both had career success, and were very socially conscious. But through the years, just like termites slowly breaking down a tree, my marriage disintegrated bit by bit. What I realized was that our values were no longer overlapping like they did. There was something that was missing. And that thing that was missing was trust. And without trust, I couldn't have a healthy relationship anymore. I realized that I was actually walking through life unconscious. And that in doing that, I was also doing a disservice to my 2 daughters, modeling a relationship that I didn't want for them. And so when I returned to Canada after my time in South Africa, I wasn't able to change my life right away. Because although I had a deep knowing of my truth, it was difficult to change from the consistency of what I knew. I wasn't willing to step into what was going to be too uncomfortable. And with time, I ended up surrendering. I could no longer push that feeling away. Now, my time in my marriage that I spent many, many years in was not all for naught, because I took a lot of time. When I realized something was off in my marriage, I dove into self-help. I read a ton of self-help books. I had a life coach, a marriage counselor, and I really was working because I thought that the problem was with me. But sadly, no matter what I did, changed our circumstances. So eventually, I got to the point where I asked for a divorce. And throughout the last few years of my marriage, we hadn't touched each other for a very long time. And just like a newborn thrives on touch, I too was suffering from skin starvation. I went into perimenopause much too early. And as they say, use it or lose it, my endocrine system was no longer producing hormones, and my energy plummeted. And where I found relief was dropping into the wisdom of my body. I found practices that rejuvenated and enlivened my body again. Things like belly dance that really got me into feeling again. And things like Hanasomatics was a psychosomatic practice that really connected my brain and my body from places that I had numbed out. Because, you see, I also noticed that the issues were stuck in my tissues, not just in my head. Another thing that I noticed when I was doing my exploration was that I felt like I had lost the ability to discern. And to me, that meant to pick up on the subtle messages in life. It's a quality and a skill that we had when we lived outside thousands of years ago. And animals still have that ability to discern. Because if they're outdoors grazing and eating their grass and they feel a vibration in the soil, or they smell a scent in the wind that's unfamiliar, then they take a moment and they observe their surroundings and decide, am I safe or am I not? And they decide how they're going to react. Now, this is a skill that I believe is very important these days because technology is really taking away our time. Because when I was a little girl, I had 2 channels, and one of them was all staticky. So I spent a whole lot of time outside because it was way more fun. And our daughters these days are not spending that same amount of time outside. So they're losing that space in nature to really feel their bodies again. And I believe it's our responsibility because technology has just exploded so fast. Parenting these days is so challenging because we're trying to figure out how do we get them off all these devices and get back out there and just play and have fun and be creative. So I feel it's our job as mothers to model to our daughters how to reconnect their body and their discernment and their intuition so that they make healthy choices in life and choose healthy relationships. Now, the way I see it, you can do a few things to reinvigorate your senses. And I call it a sensory cleanse. So one of the things I advise people to do is to get outside and get your feet on the ground. It's this fear these days of stepping on something sharp. We always have to wear our shoes. Or, we're afraid of the sun now. And then, even if you could take a bit of time in your backyard or in a park and just get your feet on the ground, sit down, find a bug, and explore and examine that little bug's world just for a few minutes, just to see what they're up to. Because you see, if you connect with that small little ecosystem of that bug's world, you can reawaken your own sensitivity to discern the subtleties in life that are always coming in our direction. Because if our daughters, for example, are going maybe on their first date, and their date wants to touch or kiss them when they're not quite ready, we want our daughters to have the tools to stand their ground, feel into their bodies, say, I'm not quite ready for this. We want them empowered to do that. We women in the West are now in a position to voice our needs, wants, and desires like no time in history. And I appreciate that fully expressing ourselves, connecting to our intuition and discernment may not come back overnight. But if we learn the tools ourselves and we teach our daughters these tools, then we will empower the brilliance of our sovereign daughters. And I believe it is our responsibility to teach our daughters the tools that they need in this world to navigate all of the social media that they're bombarded with daily. It's time that we remember and reignite the pleasure fingerprint that we knew in childhood. So tonight, I invite you to go out in one of the brightest full moons of the year, the corn planting moon. And it was historically called the corn planting moon because this was the time of year that seeds were sown in order to make it in time for the fall harvest. So I invite you tonight to go out into that bright light and sow your seed to reconnect with your little girl's pleasure fingerprint.